All right, everybody, welcome back. In session one, I challenged you all to give us at least 3 weeks. So I hope you come back after this one, because if not, we probably failed you. So let's start the session by posing a question. Can a person's soul be wounded? We want to dig into this question today because getting to the bottom of it can finally help us understand why our past experiences have such a powerful impact on our lives. Did you know that the word trauma is a Greek word meaning wound? We make it so complicated, but it's really as simple as that. Trauma is a wound that results in some absolutely miserable symptoms. There is a good chance that the desire to get rid of physical symptoms led you to join Reboot in the first place. Experts have developed thousands of treatments to help patients reduce symptoms, and generally speaking, they've been fairly successful at temporarily relieving or eliminating symptoms. But as helpful as those medication and treatments can be, there's no magic pill we can take to heal trauma's damage. That's because no one, no scientist, no doctor, or no counselor is fully able to understand or quantify all the ways trauma wounds us. We know that trauma can wound our bodies. We can probably all agree on that. It doesn't take a surgeon to see when someone has physically experienced trauma. We can see it in the evidence clearly in instances of a severed limb, a severe injury, or a loss of function. Research shows that trauma changes the physiological anatomy and performance of the brain, creating less visible physical effects such as cognitive dysfunction. Stress and trauma can also lead to cardiac and digestive diseases and even autoimmune disorders. So can we all agree that trauma wounds the body?
Yeah, I think that's super clear, right? And similarly, we also know that trauma wounds our minds and affects our emotions.
Yeah.
Right? Trauma survivors often experience changes in serotonin, norepinephrine, dopamine, and cortisol levels, leading to things like anxiety, depression, hypervigilance, these terms you might have heard before, right? Furthermore, we can observe trauma responses such as panic attacks or nightmares or mood fluctuations, which are all also common responses to trauma. So I think we can agree it affects your body, and we can also agree it affects your mind. But I think this goes back to the third question. What about our soul? Most people believe that we as humans are made up of a mind and a body and a soul, or what some might call a spirit, right? And if our souls can be wounded, what would the symptoms of a wounded soul be? And maybe even more importantly, how would we treat that wounded soul?
Someone once said that we are all spiritual beings on a physical journey. For some of you, that journey led you to combat, where your life was forever changed. While downrange, we made memories that we wouldn't trade for anything. The friendships, funny stories, and inside jokes that helped us overcome those rugged conditions still bring a smile to your face all these years later. But it wasn't all fun. And it certainly wasn't a game. While deployed, we also probably witnessed and experienced the worst of humanity. Sights, sounds, and smells have etched their way into our brains, filling our minds with memories we don't ever want to revisit. Those experiences change the way that we see the world. They change the way you see the world. Maybe you stopped trusting people or lost your sense of optimism. Perhaps you stopped sleeping, became easily angered. You came home and things weren't the same because you weren't the same. And no matter how hard you try, you can't figure out how to fully come back from war. Others of you served, but you never went to war. Maybe you missed it by a few years, and every time someone thanks you for your service, you feel like a fraud. Maybe you got hurt just before your unit deployed, and now you wonder if your brothers and sisters would still be alive if you had been there. Or maybe your wounding came gradually over years of giving the military all you could give, and now you feel left with a body that feels broken and a family that feels distant. These wounds aren't merely of the mind or body. They are more deeply rooted, more intangible, and more personal. They may not result in visible scars or abnormal chemical levels in the brain, but traumas like these are every bit as deadly as bullets and bombs. And the symptoms of those wounds are just as tough to eradicate as the infection, virus, or disease. Trauma wounds us in ways that surgery can't mend and medicine won't touch. If, in fact, trauma results in a soul wound, then we must stop thinking of trauma exclusively as mental health issues. It is a spiritual wound, then it requires spiritual tools. To put it in another way, soul wounds need a soul healer. Could it be that addressing these underlying soul wounds is the key to finally moving forward? And is it possible that we will start to experience more effective healing when we begin to use the right tool for the job? Earlier, we said that trauma is a wound that results in some miserable symptoms. In your field guide, you will see an unhealthy tree diagram. Take a moment and write down some of those potential symptoms in the boxes located in the top half of the unhealthy tree diagram. We've given you an example to get you started: depression. We've talked about vulnerability. Here it is. What are some of your symptoms that you've been experiencing? Notice that the top portion of the unhealthy tree diagram is labeled physical fruit, while the bottom is labeled spiritual roots. Most likely, it wasn't very challenging to come up with a few symptoms to add to your tree.
Right.
That's because symptoms, or what we're calling physical fruit, are constant reminders of our trauma.
Yeah.
We endure them every day. We spend an enormous amount of time and energy trying to get rid of these symptoms. We discuss them with our counselor. We take medications to reduce them and pray that God will take them away. But for many of us, our symptoms aren't getting better. In fact, despite all our efforts, things may be getting worse. Have you ever pulled a weed from the ground only to see that a new weed pops up in its place very soon after? Why does this happen? Because the weed is merely a visible indication of a much deeper and more extensive root system. In other words, the weed is a sign of something going on under the surface. Pulling the weed makes you feel good for a second, and it takes it away from your vision, and you seem like you've restored a nice, beautiful area. But when it pops back up, you realize that you've done nothing. Because if you never address the problem at the root level, the weed will only multiply and worsen over time.
Yeah.
This is how it feels for many of us on the road to recovery. We fix one issue only to see another emerge. In essence, we play a depressing game of whack-a-mole with every symptom and never seem to win. Every time we think we've identified and smashed the problem, another pops up. It's exhausting, frustrating, and demoralizing. When we leave the spiritual root wounds unhealed, the physical fruit symptoms will continue to linger.
That's right.
That's why it is absolutely critical that we understand the importance of healing our wounded souls.
Yeah, this concept, thank you, Brian, for that. This concept of soul woundedness isn't new. Investigating the spiritual components or aspects of trauma will take us all the way back to the Garden of Eden when Eve ate the apple and everything changed. It's found in Genesis chapter 3 where we read that story of Adam and Eve, right? We read how they were tempted by the serpent, they rejected God's simple instructions, and they ate of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Suddenly, evil sweeps into the world and inflicts the first soul wounds. Adam and Eve's perfect little life immediately became damaged. They had experienced trauma. Imagine suddenly being fully aware of your faults and your failures, and oh, by the way, your nudity, all at the exact same moment. Prior to the fall, Adam and Eve's life was marked by a firmly rooted sense of security, belonging, and purpose. I want you to open your field guide and find the healthy tree diagram. You know, we're going to be flipping back and forth between the unhealthy that Brian was talking about tree and the healthy tree that I'm going to talk about. So hopefully you can stick with us and kind of go back and forth. Write those words, security, belonging, and purpose, in the spaces provided for the spiritual roots on the healthy tree. I'm going to give you just a second to do that. Security, belonging, and purpose on that tree. Right? They were safe. No one was going to harm them. They belonged to each other. They literally hung out with God. How cool is that? Right? They didn't have post-traumatic stress or end up at war with some other nation. As managers of the garden, they had a job that was totally and completely fulfilling that they would never be forced into retirement from. They would never have to worry about being promoted, right? They wouldn't have to worry about what their boss thought of them because they were part of his community. They reigned over the fish, the birds, and animals. It was perfect. You know, security, belonging, and purpose. A life marked by these three words will almost always be a healthy life. Chances are, if you could describe your life as having a clear sense of security, belonging, and purpose, you'd say, I'm fairly happy. Life is pretty good. And before evil entered the world, Adam and Eve were completely healthy. They were rooted. They were balanced. That's how it was. But it didn't last. The healthy roots that God had given them became damaged when sin intersected their lives. And suddenly everything changed. Instead of resting in security, they felt afraid. Instead of sensing their belonging, they felt rejected. And instead of knowing their purpose, they felt lost. Does the same thing happen to us? I think it does, whether at a single moment or gradually over time. We experience the brokenness of the world and everything changes. Trauma tears away our security, our belonging, and our purpose, and it leaves us with a deep soul wound. At Reboot, we've identified 4 spiritual roots, or soul wounds, as we've been referring to them, that cause so many of the symptoms that we deal with on a daily basis. Flip back to the unhealthy tree diagram and write these root wounds in the spaces provided as I share them with you out loud here. Betrayal, loss, guilt, and unforgiveness. It's exactly these wounds that we'll devote a full session to every single time we meet, sessions 5 through 8. And our hope is that as we heal these roots, the fruit will begin to change. Let's look back at the symptoms that we wrote on the top portion of the unhealthy tree that Brian asked you to write down. Are these the kinds of fruit that we want to produce? Probably not. Then the question is, what kind of fruit do you hope to see grow in your life by the end of Reboot? Let's take just a second and let you brainstorm on that for a moment.
Let's go back now to the healthy tree diagram one last time. Write down some of the fruit you hear as we read Galatians 5:22 through 23. It says, "But the fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control." Isn't that the kind of fruit we want to produce?
There you go.
When our roots are healthy, these are the fruits our lives produce. When our tree is firmly planted in good soil, we'll produce good fruit no matter the circumstances in our life. In the presence of pain, we'll discover purpose. And in the depths of trauma, we will still have hope. Understanding the spiritual implications of trauma is what enables us to truly heal, not just to reduce symptoms, but to flourish and live life as God intended. But what did God intend? During this session, we talked a lot about God. We've talked about the security, belonging, and purpose He provided to Adam and Eve, and the fact that He is the soul healer. But let's get real for a moment. Many people who attend a Reboot course don't trust God and certainly don't trust those who claim to serve Him. We know that any talk of faith can justifiably be met with an eye roll, followed by a swift exit from the course. We don't want that to happen today. The truth is that Christians don't always represent Christ. Faith and religion have been used to manipulate people or to build self-serving empires of fame, money, and power. But that's not what we're doing here. Our goal isn't to trick you into agreeing with our particular worldview. So you might ask, then why even bring God into the discussion? In fact, many have even suggested that we don't include faith-specific content in this course. But in our experience, facilitating a program about trauma without addressing issues of the soul is incomplete.
That's right.
Trauma always seems to catalyze a conversation about faith.
When we experience trauma or tragedy, it pushes us to ask questions mankind has asked since the beginning of time. Why is this happening to me? Where was God? Why did they have to get hurt or die? Will there be justice for the person who did this to my unit? These questions are not easily answered, and we certainly won't answer them all in this course. But they are the right questions. At their core, they are about mankind's place in the world and the origin of good and evil. God isn't upset that we ask these questions, and neither are we. In fact, we're glad you're asking them, because asking these questions leads us to our goal of healing our wounded souls. So thank you for joining us, and we hope to see you next week.